So it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the first session of the final day of this reunion. And the topic for this morning is derivations. And we're going to hear first from Howard Lasnik, then from Andrew Nevins, then from Paul Kiparsky, and then from Tom Bever. Howard.
Thank you. I'm honored and grateful to be participating in this session, and in fact, I'm grateful to be in this field at all. So before I start, I want to particularly thank three people. That was Morris for rescuing me from the English department at Harvard, and Hadge for teaching me how to think like a syntactician, and Noam for all of the usual reasons, plus many. All right, the notion of derivations in linguistics. Morris and Hadge, I can thank for another reason. They taught the first linguistics course I ever took. It was, we called it baby syntax then, and I would say a good 2/3 of the course was about derivations in syntax, and I'm going to be rehearsing some of the issues that came up, and I think many of them are still relevant. All right, so the original model, the LSLT model, phrase structure component, context-free, non-recursive, includes lexical insertion, that is the phrase structure component does, creates P markers, which are set theoretic objects. All right, what is a P marker? Given a particular phrase structure grammar, which Chomsky called a sigma F grammar, and a particular terminal string, i.e. a string of terminal symbols, construct all of the equivalent phrase structure derivations of that terminal string. I'll say why all momentarily. Collect all of the lines occurring in any of those equivalent derivations into a set. This set is the phrase marker, a complete representation of the phrase structure of the terminal string as far as the grammar is concerned. More on that momentarily. Two phrase structure derivations are equivalent if and only if they involve the same rewrite rules, the same number of times, but not necessarily in the same order. All right, here's an artificial example. It's there. I'm sure these slides will be posted at some point, and you can go look at it. It's just a tiny little toy grammar and all of the equivalent derivations of a particular terminal string, namely, he saw Mary. A phrase marker must indicate what substrings of the terminal string are constituents, and for the ones that are, what the labels of the constituents are. In LSLT, the fundamental predicate characterizing these relations is called ISA, the ISA relation. In our simplified example, the following are the ISA relations. He is an NP, Mary is an NP, saw is a V, saw Mary is a VP, he saw Mary as an S. How do you deduce these ISA relations? Well, by comparing certain members of the phrase marker with the terminal string one by one can compute all the ISA relations as follows. So compare he saw Mary with he VP. So you reduce the common thing, and then you deduce that saw Mary is a VP. If you compare he saw Mary with he V Mary, you can deduce that saw is a V, and so on. In general, Chomsky pointed out in LSLT, no one derivation will have all of the strings necessary for this algorithm to yield all the ISA relations. That's why LSLT explicitly specified that the phrase marker contained all the strings and all of the derivations. In this regard, the LSLT theory of phrase structure was intensely derivational, not just one derivation to get what you needed, but many, many derivations. Now, it's interesting to note that we don't need the entire P marker to determine the ISA relations. Some members of the set, call them monostrings, consist of exactly one non-terminal symbol and any number of terminal symbols. Those are the only ones the algorithm, the comparison algorithm, actually uses. They're read and italicized below. So in the whole phrase marker, all the lines occurring in any of the derivations, we find the monostrings, which are S, he VP, he V Mary, he saw NP, NP saw Mary. And those are the ones you use in that comparison algorithm to deduce ISA relations. For this reason, Lasnik and Kupa in 1977, very slightly revised version of the LSLT theory, proposed a revised construct. We called it the reduced phrase marker, the set consisting just of the terminal string and all the monostrings. There was also a more significant change that I'll return to a non-derivational approach to phrase structure. Macaulay, 68, argued against the LSLT derivational theory of phrase structure. One of his arguments was roughly that we could, I'm drastically simplifying, but roughly that we could simplify the theory by creating constituent structure trees directly, rather than, Macaulay implied, by first going through all the equivalent derivations and then sort of mapping the result of that onto the trees, which Macaulay suggested, at least, are the real fundamental objects of manipulation. However, the trees in Chomsky's presentations were almost entirely for expository purposes. Chomsky's theory was set theoretic, not graph theoretic, so no conversion to trees was necessary or even relevant. So that argument rather missed the mark. Another argument was more telling and directly relevant to my concerns today. Chomsky's phrase structure rules were ordered, hence demanding derivations. We're used to thinking of, well, young people aren't, but us older people are used to thinking of transformations as ordered. But phrase structure rules in LSLT were also ordered, hence demanding derivations. If it matters if sort of the way you get from one thing to another is important, not just what you have, then that's an argument for derivations. So Chomsky's phrase structure rules were ordered, hence demanding derivations. But Macaulay showed that the ordering wasn't necessary. The ordering was invariably to capture contextual restrictions on particular lexical items, especially verbs in Chomsky's presentation. But once the model added a lexicon, as in Chomsky 65, which was just a couple years before Macaulay's paper, those ordering restrictions on phrase structure rules became irrelevant. Macaulay attributed to Richard Stanley a tree-based theory that lacked derivations. Instead, it had node admissibility conditions. And now, something I hinted at a couple of slides ago, but nothing in principle precludes a set theoretic model without derivations. So Lasnik and Kupe in 1977 presented just such a model. In that model, phrase markers are simply sets of monostrings that satisfy certain conditions, rather like the node admissibility conditions that Macaulay alluded to. Now, the transformational component of the early Chomskyan model is, of course, highly derivational. It includes an initial phrase marker, or a set thereof. The source of the initial phrase marker, or phrase markers, derivational or not, is irrelevant. This is one among many Markovian aspects of transformational derivations. All you care about in the transformational derivation is what you have now, not how it got to be that way, with one exception that I won't have time to get into now. But if you look at the list of transformations in syntactic structures, you'll find one with an explicitly non-Markovian marker on it. In the original LSLT framework, the phrase structure derivations produced only simple monoclausal structures, which could then be merged together by generalized transformations, conjoining two or possibly more. Chomsky went back and forth about whether it was two or n, separate structures, or embedding one into another. The generalized transformations constituted the recursive component of the grammar. The generalized transformations could interact with the singulary transformations, that is, those operating on a single tree rather than on a forest, in various ways. A major level of representation in this model was the T marker, the record of all the T's that applied and exactly how they interacted. Chomsky, 1965, proposed a rather radical revision of this view of syntax, and the innovation was to allow the phrase structural component itself to have a recursive character. In a way, that's conceptually a simpler theory, because the earlier theory had rewrite rules and a stipulation. The stipulation was actually a rather hard stipulation to compute, because to determine whether a system of phrase structure rules is recursive or not, it doesn't suffice to look at any one rule, or any two rules, or any three rules. There's no limit on how many rules you might have to look at to see if you go around in a circle. So this conceptually seems like a simplification, though I don't recall that as being that particular argument being given at the time. Chomsky's major arguments for this new organization were that it resulted in a simpler overall theory. Why? It eliminated one kind of operation, generalized transformations. We needed phrase structure rules. We needed singulary transformations. Did we also need generalized transformations? Well, no, not if the phrase structure rules will do the work. And at the same time, it explained the absence of certain kinds of derivations that seemed not to be needed. The second of these points is our concern here. So following Fillmore, 1963, Chomsky argued that while there's extensive ordering among singulary transformations, This came up briefly in the Reminiscences last night in Baby Syntax in 1968. We got a big pamphlet of transformations, and on the cover was the list of all the names of the transformations and a number next to every transformation, and arrows connecting some of the transformations to others of them, and every arrow indicated that there's a known argument that the rules have to come in that order. So while there's extensive ordering among singularity transformations, there are no known cases of ordering among generalized transformations, although such ordering is permitted by the theory of transformation markers. Further, Chomsky claimed that while there are many cases of singularity transformations that must apply to a constituent sentence before it's embedded, or that must apply to a matrix sentence after another sentence is embedded in it, there are no really convincing cases of singularity transformations that must apply to a matrix sentence before a sentence transform is embedded in it. The aspects theory, with its elimination of generalized transformations, was a response to these concerns. As in the LSLT theory, there's still extensive ordering among singularity transformations. In both frameworks, the set of singularity transformations was seen as a linear sequence, an ordered list. And to the extent that the orderings were crucial, there was motivation for a derivational model, rather analogous to the opacity arguments for phonological derivations. But, as they say in the infomercials, there's more. This was stolen in large part from the dust jacket of Ray Jackenduff's 1972 book, Semantic Interpretation and Generative Grammar. So we've got, what is this, D structure connected to S structure by a spring? No. Given the full aspects modification, this list of rules applies cyclically. First operating on the most deeply embedded clause, then the next most deeply embedded, and so on, working up the tree until they apply on the highest clause, the entire generalized P marker. The singularity transformations apply to constituent sentences as if before they are embedded, and to matrix sentences as if after embedding has taken place. The ordering possibilities that are permitted by the theory of transformation markers, but apparently never put to use, are now excluded in principle. And I'm going to reiterate, this was an argument presented as an argument against generalized transformations. In passing, I note that the cyclic principle was one of two major syntactic innovations of the mid-1960s, borrowed from phonology. The principle was first formulated in Chomsky, Halley, and Lukoff, 56, and applied in the phonological analysis of a variety of languages, many papers, and most notably in the sound pattern of English. Interestingly, it was almost 3 decades before it became clear that the absence of certain kinds of derivations that Fillmore had remarked on and Chomsky had remarked on further was not a real argument against generalized transformations, for it was not recursion in the base that excluded the unwanted derivations. You could, suppose you have recursion in the base, and suppose you have transformations, and now suppose you apply a transformation way up here and apply a transformation way down here. Nothing in the theory of recursion in the base, qua base rules, precludes that. What precluded it? It was the cyclic principle. And there are a variety of ways that a version of the cyclic principle could be grafted onto a theory with generalized transformations, as work of the last decade and a half or so has amply demonstrated. Derivations and interfaces. In LSLT, the T marker is the interface with semantic interpretation, and the final derived syntactic representation is the interface with morphophonemics. In aspects, we have deep structure as the interface with semantic interpretation, then the transformations operating cyclically, and the surface structure is the interface with phonetic interpretation. Already in aspects, though, and sort of hinted in a way in syntactic structures, though the model was a little different, it was pointed out that some aspects of semantic interpretation, basically all except thematic relations, depend on derived structure. One of the big issues at the time, and Barbara Partee had a very influential paper about this, and I think the issue was the name of the paper, Do Transformations Change Meaning? And it was exactly about these interface questions. With the introduction of trace theory in the early 1970s, D-structure was no longer crucial even for thematic relations, and that led to the extended standard theory and the GB model. So deep structure to surface structure via cyclic transformations, surface structure ultimately leading to phonetic form, and ultimately leading to logical form. There were at the time, and I guess continue to be, arguments for cyclicity from deep structure to surface structure. It's a little harder to find such arguments for surface structure to LF. That's why I have cyclic question mark. Though the leading concept was that the derivation from deep structure to surface structure is just of a piece with the derivation from surface structure to logical form. Same kinds of operations, same kinds of rules. But there are, another typo. There had already been suggestions in the late 60s and very early 70s for links to semantic and phonological interpretation, not just at levels, but internal to the derivation. And to the extent that those arguments are right, we have, again, evidence for derivations. Particularly important were the work of Bresnan, 71, with respect to phonology, sentence intonation, Jackendoff, 69 and 72, with respect to semantics, especially anaphora. For both, the derivation internal points were end-of-cycle structures. The picture then would look like this. Some semantic interpretation at deep structure. At the end of each cycle, some semantic and phonological interpretation, including S structure, which is the end of the last cycle. Going further back in time, recall the aspects arguments against generalized transformations. The one based on non-occurring derivations turned out to miss the mark, as was the cyclic principle that was doing the work. The simplicity argument took for granted that phrase structure rules exist and that the aspects modification thus reduced the class of basic operations from 3 to 2. But if there are no phrase structure rules, as suggested by Macaulay and again by Lasnik and Cupin, then that particular argument disappears. So an early or middle-age minimalist model of structure building where everything is done by transformations, no phrase structure rules at all. Generalized transformations then don't just merge clausal structures, as in the early model, with other clausal structures, but even lexical items with lexical items, or lexical items with structures. The derivation begins with a selection of lexical items, the numeration, which are then combined. These combinations are then combined with other lexical items and so on. Meanwhile, interspersed with these instances of so-called external merge, we also have internal merge, the classic singularly transformation movement. All these operations are constrained by some version of cyclicity. One popular one is always merge at the root of the tree. Eventually, the so-called point of spell out, the derivation branches to PF and LF. So we have this picture. Start with enumeration, cyclic derivation, spell out leads to PF and LF. There are, though, a number of reasons for thinking that Bresnan and Jackendoff were fundamentally correct about the derivational nature of the interface relations. Among many examples I could mention, Barse on intermediate reconstruction, McCloskey and Terrego on intermediate footprints, Oriegarecka on deriving certain island constraints, Fox and Pazetsky on forcing successive cyclic movement by interaction with PF property, linearization, a Merchant, 2001, based on Perlmutter, 1971, on distinctions between representational and derivational constraints. Grafting Bresnan's and Jackendoff's ideas onto the early minimalist model, we wind up with a multiple spell-out or derivation by phase picture. And that's this one. So we start with enumeration, and then we have the end of the derivation, but the end of the derivation is no more particularly privileged. Rather, it's just the end of one cycle, and at the end of each cycle, we have semantic and phonological interpretation. What I find fascinating about all these developments is that the same ideas, and sometimes even the same arguments, keep coming back in slightly revised forms and combining in slightly different ways. Does this mean that these ideas must be right, or is it just a poverty of imagination situation? I hope I'll last long enough to find out, maybe at the 100th anniversary. Thank you.
Okay, I was part of the class of 2005, and one of the great things about being at MIT, of course, was the interaction with my classmates and really the rich kind of collaboration and challenging one always gets from one's colleagues. I'll also take this opportunity, though, since I didn't last until the bitter end last night, to tell a brief Morris story. I was lucky enough to have Morris as one of my advisors when he was already retired, which meant that I could barge into his office anytime I wanted because he was always around. And so I recall in the final stages of my derivation of my dissertation, suddenly getting going to talks. One can almost make a full-time career out of going to linguistic talks. in the Boston area. And I was writing my dissertation, and I'd go and I'd say, Morris, but I just saw a talk that, shook the very foundations of linguistic theory by saying that, blah, blah. And he would say, Dostoevsky used to say, some people get drunk on dishwater. And so he would say this a couple of times, and he would say, get back to work on the problem. Some people get drunk on. So I thought this was very refreshing. It was a good mix of irreverent humor with a work ethic. And when it came time to write my dissertation, I wanted to put in the epigraph, that quote by Dostoevsky. But being a scholar, I said, Morris, I got to cite what page number that was on. And he said, well, I don't know, but it's around there somewhere. So I wrote to the world's preeminent Dostoevsky scholar, a guy in Stanford. And I said, do you know where Dostoevsky ever wrote, some people got drunk on dishwater? And he wrote back, Dear Mr. Nevins, Dostoevsky never wrote such a thing. I brought it back to Morris and showed it to him, and he said, this guy doesn't know a goddamn thing. Get back to work. So that was that. So one of the things Lasnik was talking about and alluded to is this pendular swing back and forth in terms of ideas being couched in terms of derivation and representation. And in Anderson's reflective book on phonology in the 20th century, he talks about the fact that there is very often intense periods of couching things in terms of computations and then in terms of representations and back and forth. And in fact, writing the book in 85, he kind of anticipated OT on the horizon, because he said, well, here we are with this great preoccupation with autosegmental representations, the kind of things that Bruce Hayes was interested in back in 1993, but soon enough people will be interested instead in parallel computations and sort of forget about representations. And so this pendular swing seems to be going back and forth. What I want to argue today is that there are insights in both, and that they can be integrated if you have certain types of representations with their own properties that are then derivationally chained. And in fact, we find something like this today in lexical phonology and morphology in its OT incarnation, which says there are stem, word, and phrase levels, each of which have their own representational properties, but they themselves are derivationally chained. I want to show you just two examples from the history of linguistics where these poles of describing relations of basically opacity in terms of derivation and representation are contrasted. And I'll go first to the case of S-voicing. As you may know from SPE, there is a pervasive rule of S-voicing, which even leads some people to say words like parasitic gaps, which applies in words like resent, but doesn't apply in words like recede, where underlyingly recede is based on rekeyed. K becomes S by velar palatalization, but does not become recede. Okay? And the idea there typically was that there's an extrinsic ordering relation that says velar palatalization applies after S-voicing, and so by the time S-voicing would come around, it's too late. Okay? This is a counter-feeding relation based on the nature of the rules. Now, you could have a representational solution which said when you delink K in velar palatalization, that leaves a trace of a dorsal node in the representation. You would do something like this. And that dorsal node is still floating around in some particular way that it blocks S-voicing from happening. But that seems like an overly rich move to make. That seems like, well, why enrich the representations to that point that you could have S-voicing blocked in precisely that way? On the other hand, if we take wanna contraction, there is a possibility in terms of derivational ordering, which apparently Joan Bresnan had. It says does not apply, and then in this case, movement happens. So the reason that wanna contraction would not apply in the case of WH movement is, again, because of an ordering of the relations that says wanna contraction is ordered before WH movement, can't apply here in this specific case, and then later WH movement applies, but it's too late. Again, a counterfeeding relation. But in that case, Having a trace block Wanna contraction, a representational solution, is viewed as somehow a more insightful way than simply ordering these relations in this way. So there are these two poles. For certain problems, opacity looks better or more insightfully explained in terms of ordered transformations. In other cases, a representational solution seems somehow more insightful. Now, there are cases where the two can be integrated, and I want to focus here quickly on the interaction in the case of Ryder between diphthong raising and flapping. Now, in the case of diphthong raising and flapping, we have these two rules, and these two rules have different properties. Diphthong raising, for example, has diphthong raising, also called Canadian raising, has lexical exceptions. So apparently, even for people who will say right, like, and so forth, they'll say cyclops. They won't say cyclops, okay? There are lexical exceptions, and it doesn't apply across word boundaries. Lie for me doesn't become lie for me, okay? So these two properties of diphthong raising are different from flapping. Flapping applies across word boundaries, at a party, or what have you, and is exceptionless within words. So now the idea, which has been proposed, for example, by Bermudez-Otero, is that the properties of these rules, the properties of the fact that diphthong raising has lexical exceptions, doesn't apply across word boundaries, while flapping has no lexical exceptions, does apply across word boundaries, gives an insight into why they're ordered the way they are. The properties that diphthong raising has make it a lexical rule. The properties that flapping has make it a post-lexical rule. Those are two different types of representations, and the ordering between those processes follows from the properties of each of those processes. So this is a promising way of looking at things. Derivations and representations are, in this sense, integrated in the sense that the representational properties that a particular process is sensitive to will yield its ordering in terms of an overall derivational architecture. And what I want to show you today is one case study of this type of reasoning. Has to do with what I'll call morphotactics. Now, this is work that I've done in collaboration with Carlos Arregui. He was part of the formidable class of 2002, and he was back at MIT as a visiting professor in 2006. He's now at the University of Chicago. And at that time, we started to go through Irizar's 6-volume set of forms of the verb have and be in Basque. Okay, so I know Northern Italian shows a lot of variation, but Basque has 6 volumes of the verbs have and be across all of the dialectal forms. And there is a huge amount of variation, and this variation looks like it's the result of what we call morphotactic operations. Morphotactic meaning specific to morphology, and the idea here is that morphology has its own well-formedness constraints, specific to morphology, and that morphology implies tactics, namely repair operations, such as morphological deletion, morphological metathesis, morphological epenthesis, specifically in response to the well-formedness constraints that hold on words, a distinct level of representation. This is the overall architecture we have in mind, and you see here that syntax is one module of the grammar, post-syntax is another module of the grammar, but within post-syntax are a number of distinct submodules. And each of those submodules have specific representational properties. Now, one of the guiding principles in this type of work, which I think is a useful methodological dictum, is the notion that the higher up you are on the road to PF, or as Chomsky was kind of talking about, on the way towards externalization, the more universal and principled the operations will be. The further you go down this chain, the more you will find language-specific and dialect-particular operations. So I want to show you 2 operations that occur specifically at the level of morphotactics, specifically related to well-formedness in words and their derivational ordering. So first I have to give you a brief crash course in the Basque auxiliary. It's actually pretty simple. There's an auxiliary root, something like have or be, and that auxiliary root encodes agreement, it encodes tense, and it encodes voice, have or be. So in this specific case, you see here's the auxiliary root, it's present tense, and this sentence is something like, you have seen me. You see you here is ergative, me is absolutive, and those pronominal arguments are doubled by clitics. So suk is doubled by su, a clitic. Ni is doubled by a clitic. And the ordering of those clitics is always, or 99% of the time, and of course the mismatches are what's interesting, doubled by an absolutive clitic in proclitic position to the left of the auxiliary, and ergative and datives enclitics to the right of the auxiliary. And that's the form of the auxiliaries. That's it. Okay. Now, there are two rules, two processes I want to show you. One is a process of morphological dissimilation. And this is specific to the auxiliary. It has no effect on the arguments themselves. So and this is not even in all dialects of Basque, but in all of the Biscayan dialects of Basque, which is a significant dialectal subgroup, there is a constraint against first-person plural and second-person singular plural in the same word. That is, having the two clitics on the same auxiliary. It's not a syntactic problem because, as you'll see, the clitics are doubling arguments that can happily live ever after. But it is a problem having them on the same morphological word. And the repairs to this constraint vary considerably cross-dialectally. And I want to contrast just two dialects today, Andaru and Zamudio. And in Andaru, when you have first-person plural and second-person, you delete the internal argument when it's first-person plural. In Zamudio, you delete the external argument when it's first-person plural. So this really looks quite different from, let's say, a syntactic constraint, like the person-case constraint. It's not always hierarchical. Dialects seem to differ. Do I delete this one or this one? It is a constraint that, by hypothesis, is after syntax, and hence insensitive to hierarchical representations, and before linearization, and hence insensitive to linear representations. It's just a feature co-occurrence constraint, a syntagmatic markedness constraint that bans identical elements, in this case that both share participant feature. So the repairs then are different. You see that, for example, in Zamudio, you delete the expected first-person ergative, and so instead of it showing up, you have a form without the ergative clitic. The root also changes as a result of allomorphy. In Andaru, on the other hand, you delete the internal arguments, so you have given us the book, you have given us the book, but instead of the dative clitic appearing, that form is simply deleted. No effect, as you notice, on the corresponding pronominal arguments. Okay, so here we have one rule of deletion. It's a morphotactic constraint against two particular person features occurring in the same word. Now, a second process that occurs within the Basque auxiliary is morphological metathesis. And this is necessarily sensitive to linearized representations. So the constraint here is one that requires that the auxiliary root, which I showed you before, is second position within the word. Okay? This is like familiar V2, like a Wackernagel constraint V2, except not within the phrase, within the word. The auxiliary root needs to be the second morpheme within the word. Now that's usually guaranteed by, as we saw, having an absolutive proclitic to its left. But suppose the syntax doesn't deliver that result. Something needs to happen, and there are two repairs. One of those repairs is metathesis, moving a clitic that would otherwise be at the right edge to the left edge in order to satisfy M2, or epenthesis, sticking in essentially the equivalent of a morphological expletive in order to satisfy M2. Now, although it may be very tantalizing to view these as syntactic and to say, that looks just like merge and move. You either merge an expletive or move something to that position. You'll notice that these repairs are usually cleft along tense lines. That is to say, metathesis is the repair employed in the past tense, epenthesis in the present tense. I can't see any principled theory of syntax that would correlate those with expletive insertion versus movement, and I really think that the nature of these repair operations being somewhat idiosyncratic in response to the same unified constraint is a good argument for localizing them post-syntactically rather than syntactically. Let me show you a couple of examples. So in the past tense there, you see that something like you saw John has the ergative clitic occurring to the left of the auxiliary root. And by hypothesis, what's happened here is metathesis. John, a third-person absolutive, doesn't generate a clitic. The poor auxiliary is left naked to its left, and metathesis occurs as a repair, moving something over here specifically to fill this position. This is the only case where you see an ergative clitic occurring to the left of the auxiliary. A similar example here from Samudio. Whereas in the present tense, we have epenthesis, we have D-support, if you like, occurring, and furnishing a morpheme to the left of the auxiliary root in order to satisfy this second position requirement. Okay, so I've shown you two morphotactic processes, and now the question is, can we find any derivational interactions between them? And if so, how might that follow from the very nature of these operations themselves? So in this architecture, as you may have noticed, there are operations that are pre-linearization and post-linearization. Participant dissimilation, the one I showed you that deletes either a first plural or a second person clitic, are pre-linearization. They're blind and insensitive to linear representations. Metathesis necessarily is post-linearization. So the properties of the rules are now going to guide us towards a notion of what their derivational sequencing is. So first I'll show you a case where dissimilation feeds metathesis, that is to say, where the first process necessarily precedes the second one. In this case, you saw us in Indaru. If you recall in Indaru, what happens is when you have first plural and second person in the same word, the internal argument clitic is deleted. As a result, the clitic that was happily furnishing this position was deleted, and in order to then fill that position, that fed metathesis. The ergative clitic moved from here to here. The ergative clitic is higher and should be to the right. This is a right-headed language, so higher things should be to the right. It shows up in the wrong place. And this syntax morphology mismatch is a consequence of two morphotactic operations that say, the first one says, I don't like having two participant features in the same word, so delete one. The derivation chugs along. The second module says, I need something to my left there, and subsequently metathesis occurs to satisfy the second position requirement. Now this is an Andaru, and we're going to look at the other dialect of Thamudio and see a radically different effect. In this case, dissimilation bleeds metathesis. So what's happening here is, if you recall, in this dialect, it's the ergative clitics that are deleted. So here, we accompanied you to the station. This has an ergative and has a dative, which is pro-dropped in this case. There is no absolutive. What would normally happen would be that the ergative would metathesize over here. But it's deleted in response to the this dissimilatory constraint, and as a result, epenthesis happens. Now, this is a very opaque form for two reasons. Number one, epenthesis normally doesn't apply in the past tense, but it is applying here in the past tense. And the reason it's applying in the past tense is because the derivation is myopic. It has a lack of look ahead. In one module, it says, I have to get rid of that ergative clitic, without knowing later that might be useful for metathesis. Okay? Each module has its own well-formedness requirements, and the derivation doesn't know, hey, don't delete that ergative, I'm going to need that later to metathesize. As a result, epenthesis occurs for the second position requirement. So to conclude then, what we've shown here is that you can have a strategy in morphotactics very parallel to that within phonotactics, where the intrinsic properties of rules, whether they're sensitive in this case to linearization or not, assigns them to specific modules. And then these modules themselves, each of which have distinct representational characters, are derivationally chained. So properties that we know and love from derivations, such as over-application, such as counterfeeding, such as lack of look-ahead, fall out from the representational sensitivity of each of these processes. Thank you very much. Here's a tiered representation.
What? Okay. Have no intuitions about PCs, only Macs. Okay.
PCs are illegal in California.
They should be. Oh, there we are. Great. Now I know. Perfect. Yeah, it's been an emotionally and intellectually charged couple of days, and I'd really like to thank Donka and Sabine and everybody here who's made it possible and who's organized it so beautifully. And I'm also extremely proud to have been invited and to have been paired with Andrew Nevins, another student of Maurice Hallis, 40 years after I graduated. He graduated, and we have actually shared a great many interests, and so it's been really nice to have thought through his work also again in preparation for this. And this gives me also a golden opportunity to put into action one of Maurice's injunctions, and more particularly a corollary of it, which I'm going to now engage in a little bit. And so actually, in my opinion, the best way of argumentation is theory comparison. But I'll begin with a brief history of derivations in phonology, which I was requested by the organizers, and we can start 2,500 years ago, as Noam explained in his lecture, but we can take a big jump to the 20th century, and until really Stanley in 1967, who was mentioned in the first talk, really the model based on rules wasn't questioned. It was the only game in town, but Stanley pointed out that there were some arguments for actually treating at least part of phonology in terms of constraints. And it was really Kisseberth who tried to show that you could gain something by way of explanation by doing so, because you could factor out the shared context of rules that operated towards the same goal by having constraints that took care of those common conditions, and thereby translating functional unity into formal simplicity. However, this only was partially successful because you can't simplify rules which are triggered by a constraint, and there were cases where you apply the rule and then have later repairs, and finally, because of a lack of substantive constraints on targets. So then followed a kind of period of confusion and experimentation. There was Stamp's theory, in which you had a strictly processual account, but you distinguished between, on the one hand, rules which were learned and processes which were innate, and they could interact only in certain ways. And then a variety of theories in which you mixed processes and constraints in all sorts of ways that turned out to be formally very difficult to manage. And by far the most successful of these new theories that emerged then was, of course, optimality theory, which claimed that ranked constraints uniquely determine the processes that implement them. Constraints are violable, but violation is minimal. So you could do triggering and blocking just by ranking, as shown schematically here. And the key idea was the constraint system evaluates output representations, so the mapping between output representations and input representations through faithfulness constraints. And ranking determines a grammar, the possible rankings, a typological space. So it's also a theory of naturalness, given or to the extent that the constraints are grounded and universal. And as we know, there's a derivational residue that people have been breaking their heads over, two major problems mentioned yesterday the first one mentioned by Bruce Hayes, opacity, and there's also cyclicity, which doesn't yield to a parallel account. Two types of solutions continue to be debated. One, the introduction of transderivational faithfulness constraints, sympathy constraints, output-output constraints, or transderivational constraints over faithfulness relations, OTCC, all of which I think are formally quite intractable. There's nothing that you can prove about them or implement computationally or anything. And the other is that you have, back to a certain amount of modularity, a level-ordered cascade of classic OT constraint systems, that's Stradal OT or LPM OT, as Nevins called it, where expressions are actually interpreted incrementally as they're built up. You add a morpheme, interpret it semantically and phonologically, go and repeat the process. And this kind of interleaving has now also been adopted in the latest distributed morphology work in Embig's book. So now I want to look at two particular implementations for vowel harmony of two of these respective views, and also take a quick peek at the Basque stuff that we just heard about from the optimality theory point of view. So what Andrew in his books proposes are leading ideas that I think are, you have to accept. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we want to stick to if we do phonology and morphology. Locality and a restrictive theory, phonetic grounding and naturalness and markedness, and that's already controversial. There are people who say naturalness has no place in phonology. Modularity, he separates morphology from syntax, and that's kind of a break with distributed morphology in a way. And cross-modular structural parallelism, kind of Jacobsonian idea that syntax, phonology, and morphology all work according to the same kinds of principles. And really, the only disagreement that I have with him is how to best achieve these goals. And his proposal is that you have rules plus constraints that block rules, constraints that trigger rules, two different kinds of constraints, and a very ramified functional submodularization. There's those different subcomponents within the morphology or post-syntax, as he calls it, that we just heard about. Well, for Stradal OT, we have only constraints, cyclically evaluated, and the submodules are not functional. They're not little groups of processes that do particular kinds of things, but they're structural. They're stems, words, and larger units like phrases and whatever. And I think also, although this is kind of extrinsic, we want to take this idea of parallelism a lot further and have constraint-based approaches in phonetic implementation, as Edward Fleming is doing, in metrics, as many people who do metrics have argued, although it's also not universally accepted, and in processing. So here's the way it would work out for vowel harmony in Andrew's proposal. There's a search procedure, so an element. The whole thing is analogous to agreement. A needy element initiates a search for a feature, stops as soon as it finds the closest element that bears the relevant feature, and copies the values of that feature. If it can't find a feature, then it defaults to a specified value. And there's also parameters like what features count as relevant. It could be all values, contrasted values, or marked values. An identity requirement, you could require that the vowels otherwise be identical, and then some limits on the distance of the search and the kinds of elements that you can cross. So from the optimality theoretic perspective, and again, just as there are many ways in which you could build a theory of vowel harmony in the rule-based theory, we've just taken one. There are several that you could do in optimality theory as well, and I'm just, again, going to take the one that I proposed with Karl Pajusalu 8 years ago. By no means the only possibility. So the idea then is that phonology essentially is a negotiation of conflicting claims of markedness constraints, which could be syntagmatic, that is, things that happen because things are next to each other, or absolute, because things that happen, there's complexities of segments tend to be eliminated, and faithfulness constraints, which want to retain them. So for harmony, that would mean that you have a harmony constraint, markedness constraints, and faithfulness constraints, which privilege particular spots, like the first vowel, the time flies, the stem. You can conjoin constraints, and they're cyclically evaluated. So in Finnish, let's take a word. Järjestelmällistyttämättömyydellensä käänköhän. So you notice that the root vowel is front, and then all the other vowels that you can, well, they are all front, versus suunnitelmallistuttamattomuudellansa kaankohan, where all the vowels that you can have as back vowels are back. And the intermediate, you can see that there are some vowels, E and A, which stay invariant, and that's because they are neutral. Okay, so you have a vowel system in which there are two unpaired vowels, E and A. And they're neutral in many ways, so they also, besides, as in this example, behaving like front vowels when they are in the trigger position, they co-occur with, so I'm sorry, sort of, so the first thing I should say is that the front and back vowels that are harmonic, u-o-a and u-ö, don't co-occur. So you can have pouta and pöytä, but you can't mix up those vowels. Or, and in suffixes, the suffix automatically assimilates to the frontness or backness of the stem. Neutral vowels, unpaired, don't undergo suffix harmony, transparent to suffixal harmony, so you have tarina or tarina, but you can't have tarina or tarina. And they freely occur with back vowels in stems, pina, vita, trigger front harmony in suffixes, so you must say pina or vita, you can't say pina. Although that's a perfectly fine stem, it's not a possible inflected word. A very complex behavior. That's where the trick comes in Finnish vowel harmony, to manage the many phases of neutrality. It's clear that the 5 unmarked vowels are what you would expect, perfectly correlates with frequency. The marked vowels a, u make up a small fraction of the total frequency. So the constraints would be, first of all, an absolute constraint, context-free, that bars back E and A, marked harmony conjoined with markedness constraints forbidding a marked vowel, faithfulness to the initial syllable and to the stem, and then the general harmony constraints. If you rank them in this way, you get Finnish. If you rank them in other ways, you get a bunch of other languages, and that's what we showed in our paper. So here's for stems. Stems are subject only to marked harmony, so the check-marked ones are possible. The ones that are shaded out are out because they contain a violation in the domain, both of the constraint against markedness and against the constraint that prohibits disharmony. Following that, here, unfortunately, these tableaus get a bit big. This one is very simple, but you can see in the first 2 displays how this distinguishes between the inflected word, let's say abstractly a stem with E, followed by a suffix with A, which is going to front, and a stem that contains internally E and A, which are going to turn out different because one of them is protected by the requirement that the stem be preserved, which is ranked between marked harmony and the general harmony rule. So here's what Andrew says. Harmony applies in suffixes and within roots. A needy vowel seeks a contrastive feature to its left. Transparent E and A are excluded from the search. Otherwise, minus back default is assigned. And non-initial stem syllables within a word also undergo harmony, as he shows very nicely with evidence from language games. So for disharmony, which you have in loans, you specify vowels as non-needy. Here's the first argument that I think you might give against that, which is nativization. So for Peugeot, you get Peugeot. For Trotuli, you get Rotuli, Olympia, Pulituri, etc. If you use it as furniture polish, you probably say Pulituri, and if you drink it, you call it Pulituri. So you have Kiina and Metro and so forth are never going to turn into Kiina or Metro. And that's obviously predicted by the ranking I've proposed, because Kiina and Metro are not violations of the system at all, whereas Trotuli and so forth are. Now, the search and copy approach doesn't actually have a harmony constraint. It really has to specify the distribution of neediness by something like a look-ahead rule. A stem vowel is needy if its needs will be satisfied by copying, but not if its needs will be satisfied by default assignment, which is a bit maybe strange. Secondly, E and A don't trigger harmony from monosyllabic consonant roots. So although you have, as you might expect on the right, itkeskely, pienenness, and so forth with harmony, you do have derived words. They're all bisyllabic, or at least the harmony pair is contained in the first two syllables. You have itku, hilos, and so forth. The analysis is that the minimal stem is disyllabic, so the monosyllabic root is not a cyclic constituent, and so they're going to behave exactly like monomorphemic words. So itku is exactly like letku, for example. Then we do have feature-changing vowel harmony, so a vowel has to be needy even though it's fully specified. For example, moinen, which means such, when it's used as a suffix, as in kummoinen, mimmoinen, tämmöinen harmonizes, as you can see in the last example. So how does it get to be needy? Well, there's lots of examples in Hungarian and other languages of feature-changing harmony, and we know that it exists in assimilation. So constraint-based theory actually unifies harmony with other assimilation processes. No problem for that. Now, fourth argument, suppose we had a language in which we had more vowels. Well, that we found in Seto and Võru. Actually, they're identical, but one of them is a language, the other one is a dialect of Estonian. It just happens to, they're called, the one that is spoken by Orthodox people in Russia is a dialect of Estonian. The one that's spoken in Estonia is a separate language. So that's neither here nor there, but back vowel E, back vowel U is harmonic, and that's really the essential point. We have two extra vowels, but let's concentrate on that extra vowel back E. So it's harmonic. So what's the distribution? You get 3 combinations out of 4. You get suna, sinä, and stuff like ilma. So you get all but the one combination that involves marked disharmony. So the back E plus front A. And that's predicted by the constraints. Whereas it's, I couldn't figure out how to do this in the search procedure, because no matter what you search for, distinctive values or for marked values, you seem to get the wrong result. Then the final point is that the domain of harmony in Finnish seems to be the prosodic word. So this is a little bit complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but it's based on just Google searches. Google searches are okay in Finnish because nobody but native speakers write Finnish, so you can get reliable results. And so you get back harmony categorically in the lower cases and optionally in the top half. And it correlates in an interesting way with all the indicators for lexical stress, of which one is whether you have T deletion in the partitive plural. There's also the illative plural. There's also consonant gradation before. And then there's quite a lot of independent fixes on inherent lexical stress. And so what we see is that when there is an inherent lexical stress, as shown by those criteria, then you get optional harmony. So the analysis is that monomorphemic long words, the ones that consist of 2 feet, can be optionally treated as prosodic compounds, in which case just the second part consists of the harmonic domain. So the point of that is that we need some kind of prosodic constituency, rather than, I think, theories about the intervening elements, which we don't need on this view. So conceptual advantages, the computation on the OT view does not need to refer to distinctiveness, which seems to be an inherently global property. It can just look at what it sees in the representation itself rather than have to scan the vowel system for related vowels. It unifies harmony with other assimilation processes, and it relies on independently motivated prosodic domains rather than harmony particular parameters. I have something on Basklytics, but I've just been flashed the stop sign, so I will, if there's discussion afterwards of the Bas stuff, then I'll reserve the right to come back to the remaining slides. Thank you.
Okay, while there is a switch
Well,
in...
use the mic, yeah.
While there's a switch in computers, I will regale you with the story of how Ed Klima's toupee and Barbara Hall resulted in my becoming a psycholinguist. Ed taught the basic syntax course early on at MIT, and he sported a toupee, which we all figured actually was originally made of copper because it had taken on a lustrous green quality. And whenever he looked down at his notes to check on something, there would be this glow that came, this green glow from the top of his head, which was distracting. But not as distracting as the fact that Barbara sat in the front row, and Bruce Fraser and I were sitting in the last row, appropriate in the European style for the level of scholarship that we had maintained. And Ed would say something completely incomprehensible, and Bruce and I would be going, what? What did he say? What was that? Meanwhile, Barbara is saying in a very loud voice in the front row, "Oh, I see." And so Ed figured that the class understood, and he would go on to the next impenetrable statement, at which point Bruce and I, well, actually Bruce ended up in syntax, but I figured, I don't understand a bit about what's going on here. It took me years to figure out what syntax might be about. It took me years to figure out that nobody else was sure either. So I turned to psycholinguistics. Now I have a auditory test here. Let's just make sure it's working before I engage in the talk and before the timer starts. Okay, it works. Let me check this. That works. Okay, so this is my first linguistic text. As you can see, I was destined from a very early age to end up in the field that I am in. I had this book when I was 4 years old. It really doesn't look from the character as though grammar can be fun. But words are perhaps more powerful than pictures in this case. It even had a short section on aspects of do support that I was exposed to at a very early age. And so I really had no choice about what field to entertain. And so what I've been doing, and we'll speak a little bit about today, is trying to understand where linguistic universals come from, insofar as there are universals that are extrinsically based as opposed to intrinsically based in the nature of language itself. And the method has been a fairly classic one, to try to pare away the mechanism for the use or representation of language from the structure of what language is. And the purpose is not to do away with linguistic structure. The purpose is to understand properly what is uniquely linguistic, so that when we get to the point where we can actually be doing some serious biological and genetic work, we actually know what we're looking for, and we don't start looking for the wrong things. So there is an ordering in the sciences which starts with linguistics as presumably the most airy-fairy, and then we have psychology and then biology, and of course the ultimate one is physics, but not exactly according to the mathematicians, and we have a classification available of different kinds of universals as discussed in some writings today. Now let's think about the notion of derivation, since it's the topic of today. From a standpoint of behavior or a psycholinguist, it's a real bear of a problem because language, whatever its modality of externalization is serial, mostly. I mean, sign language has some parallel stuff in a way more than spoken language, but it's basically serial. And derivations are not, in general. Derivations have a kind of, metaphorically speaking, a vertical component. And this sets the puzzle. How can derivations be assigned when you understand sentences, learned when you learn the language, or neurologically represented and computed from serial input? What's going on that makes this transformation possible? Well, the first point that I want to make of the three that I will make has to do with different aspects of derivations. And this is research done by my colleague Natasha Warner on the question of what happens to language when it's actually in conversational speech, as opposed to the kind of speech that we imagine we hear from each other and that we imagine children hear. The point about imagining it is that our imagination is false. So here I will play an excerpt from a conversation, and I just want you to listen to it. Let's see if it's going to be loud enough. It'll be loud enough. Okay. Does anyone understand that? It's 4 words. Okay, here it is in a sentence.
Do you have time to talk to me for a little while?
Do you understand it now? I'll do it again.
Do you have time to talk to me for a little while?
Okay, here's another one. Well, actually, this is my favorite over here, I think.
Shown in
I'll give you a hint. This would be most likely to be said in Southern California, at least in terms of one's image.
shown in
Okay, here it is in its context.
our Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa, but
I'll do it again.
our Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa, but
Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa.
our Tuesday night when we were chilling in the spa, but
The acoustics don't help much. But what's the point here? Well, the point is that, especially from the first example, do you have time? Which is, you didn't understand, but as soon as it was, do you have time to talk to me for a while, you did understand it. And the point about it is, you didn't have the feeling that there was a second in there where you didn't understand anything, and then later you put it together because you got the rest of the sentence. You hear it as something, I'll play it again, you hear it as something that is continuously analyzed as you hear it. That's your conscious.
Do you have time to talk to me for a little while?
But we know that when you started hearing just this,
Do you have time?
you didn't know what you were hearing. And so the point is that there's a notion here of what I call the psychological moment, or the consciousness moment, if we want to put it that way, in which there must be some kind of backwards as well as forwards processing, but the conscious percept is actually of simply time flowing continuously. And one of the interesting questions that arises in my mind, and what I'm talking about in today's talk, essentially is problems that I'm interested in working on in the future, not necessarily having solved in the present. But the question is whether phases actually play a role in defining tamper-proof units that in themselves correspond to what I'm calling the psychological moment of consciousness. That a phase is something where you can actually move back and forth with mutual constraints, interpret it, and then move on to something else. But the percept, the conscious percept that you have is nonetheless one of serial time moving forward. And I think this is a vastly understudied phenomenon in the case of language, in the case of cognitive science in general. We have the same problem with vision, that I'm taking snapshots, I'm not taking a continuous picture of what's going on here in the room, but I'm creating, the system is creating a continuous representation. And this is a very, I think, a very important problem, very puzzling problem, and one that I think will be with us for a long time, but I think it's very important. This problem also hits the child, and perhaps hits the child in a way conceptually harder than the adult. That is, when we think about language acquisition and formal models of language acquisition, we look at motherese or caretakerese, and we articulate it in terms of this is what the child gets, a series of words, maybe a series of syllables, but it's all very well defined. And then the problem is, how does the child discover derivations, the particular derivations that are relevant for its language, given this serially organized input? But that isn't what the child gets. Here's a fragment from a mother talking to her child.
And rip 'em.
How's that?
And rip 'em.
Okay, here's the whole sentence.
Look, great, Mommy moved those magazines so you couldn't get them and rip them.
Still couldn't get it? Maybe it's too loud. Let me make it a little softer. Try this.
Look, great, Mommy moved those magazines so you couldn't get them and rip them.
And rip them. Yeah, well, I assure you that if it was in a small room with acoustics and you were the little child, you would have gotten it, but the acoustics aren't great. So it's oh, Mommy did something or other with the magazines so you couldn't get them and rip them.
Look, great, Mommy moved those magazines so you couldn't get them and rip them.
Okay, so the point is that it's hard for you to know what was said. Think about, again, if you think there's an orderly progression from the words up to the phrases, up to the sentences, and then the problem is for the child to figure out what are the rules that organize the words and the phrases in the right way, that there's a much more immediate acoustic problem, psychoacoustic problem that the child has, given that the child very often, perhaps not always, but very often is exposed to conversational speech. And of course, I don't know about you, but when I was a child, I was much more interested in what the grown-ups were saying to each other than what they were saying to me. And what they were saying to each other was definitely conversational, even if sometimes they looked at me and articulated things with stupefying clarity. So most of what the learning the child does, I think it also depends on this. So what we have to assume, and has been assumed, the question is how to cash it out, is that oh, for heaven's sakes, that the child that the child has to have available a mixture of statistical sensitivities on the basis of which it can build up hypotheses, which it can then apply to test against what it's hearing. I won't go through all of this by virtue of time. But one way of expressing this is to think in terms of a form of analysis by synthesis model of acquisition in which there's an alternation conceptually between building up statistical regularities in the language and then attempting to, having incorporated some statistical patterns, to access one's armamentarium of formal devices to construct a model that will actually create derivations for what you have statistically mastered. Evidence for this, for the child as the little linguist who is practicing the language, comes from the work of Ruth Weir, for example, who recorded kids in their cribs before they went to sleep and listened to them practice their language. A recent example that came to my attention from my Russian nephew is a simple example like this. His aunt, my wife, said to him in much better Russian than I can say, something of the form "Nado ubit muhu," which means we got to kill the fly. And the nephew was familiar with mucha, which is the nominative of fly, and the nephew kind of frowned, looked down, said, "Mucha, muhu, mucha, muhu, mucha, muhu." And so it was clear that the kid was getting it, but that he was rehearsing the concept that, oh, when you do it to the fly, then it's muhu. This is just interesting evidence of the child as little linguist, as Jenny Valian has called it. So acquisition depends, and I'm suggesting that part of the process is building up statistical regularities that your language offers you, and then trying to figure out the structural properties that will derive the patterns that you've managed to master through their statistical consistency. And we had heard today discussed, in the case of Basque morphology, the notion that there were certain kinds of canonical patterns in the Basque morphological structure that were arrived at by different ways in different dialects, but some kind of consistency. Hadge Ross brought to our attention the notion of conspiracy in general in the late 19th century. And here are some examples from English in which there's a very strong, a very powerful surface phrase sequence, but also some regularities in the mapping onto the deep structure. Basically, the idea is that the reason there are canonical forms, which is something that has been puzzling linguistics, it was part of the second and third lecture of today, how to deal with the idea that there are computational derivations, but at the same time they seem to have a conspiratorial effect of sorts, arriving at a smaller number of canonical forms. The idea is that this is absolutely necessary in attested languages, even if not in formally describable languages, to give the child a leg up into learning the language. There are implications, for example, with respect to determining this nature of universals. I've argued that, in fact, the extended projection principle, which is a wart or a carbuncle on the side of minimalism as a stipulated derivational constraint, may be resolved as actually having as its real source the requirement that sentences have a surface form that's canonical in any given language. But I don't have time to deal with that. The last point has to do with the idea raised in great and elegant detail, as always, by Howard, which is the notion of cyclicity, which has another way of thinking about it is that it's been consistent across a variety of syntactic architectures since the 1950s, which is that trees are built or movement occurs working its way up a tree, not down a tree. Well, one reason for this could be the computational reason that was mentioned by Noam in his talk here, which is that you need to have a mechanism to take small bits of language and put them together to make something bigger. And merge is one way of doing that. Ray suggested in the first session that unification is another way of doing it. My way of understanding unification is that it's basically merge on a big scale, putting together bigger clumps of things as opposed to two at a time. But the operation, the notion of building something up is the same. And the question of interest here is what kind of neurological mechanisms might be co-opted to provide the basis for this upward construction of structures, especially given, again, that the serial problem, of course, is that they occur left to right, not from bottom up. And what has interested me is the possibility, and again, this is for further research, just beginning to attack the problem, is that the mechanisms that have been recruited neurologically to represent and organize and compute upward processes, meaning by upward I mean processes from a more embedded portion of structure to a less embedded, moving up the tree or creating the tree from bottom up, depending on your point of view, that the mechanisms are basically derived from mechanisms or parasitic on mechanisms that evolved over a long period of time for vision. We know that from comparative neurology that much of the neurological basis for language corresponds to areas in our close simian relatives that are devoted to vision and that have a long evolutionary history. And if we look at that, we see that especially as articulated, for example, by David Pöppel and Greg Hickok, that in today's way of thinking, their way of thinking about it, there are dorsal pathways and ventral pathways, two major pathways that correspond to this area and this area of the brain that correspond to different kinds of computational processes or circuits that carry out different, or participate in different processes. And there's a particular set of structures, the superior temporal gyrus and sulcus, that are mediating essentially in the middle of these, although more part of the dorsal pathway in these circuits. And if we look at the dorsal and ventral pathway in the case of vision and what they seem to maintain, the dorsal pathway, which is the important one here for our purposes, is roughly the pathway that processes or is related to processing the where information, how, in spatial relations. And in particular, part of the dorsal pathway, the STG and SDS, are associated in animal studies, with computing conspecific species motion recognition, something that we don't think about very often, but that is a very natural part of life, the ability to look across a field and recognize that it's a human as opposed to a moose. But if you're a moose, you immediately recognize that it's a moose and not a dog. And if you're a dog, you recognize that it's a dog and not a rabbit. So there's a lot of built-in, or at any rate available, computational structure in the visual system. And the question is, how does that work? What I want to suggest is that it also works bottom-up. So here's an example from Johansson, who was a signal figure in showing that you can reconstruct the animal that you're looking at from a couple of points of light, as long as that animal moves. This doesn't look like much here, but, oops, sorry, I gave it away, but if now it'll work. Uh-oh. Let's try again. I should have checked out this. There we are. Okay, so suddenly you see a man walking, at least I hope you do. So here's another example. So the question is, who's this, or what is it? Any ideas? Okay, well, anyway, this is an ape walking. Okay, and here's another one. Should be easier, yeah, I think. Come on, there we are. Yeah, that's a dog. And then here's one of my favorites. Oops, sorry. Any idea what that is? That's a seal. Okay, now what's the point? The point is that I have, is that 1 minute? Okay, fine. The point is that there's a vector in each case of motion. I don't know whether up here it was going this way or this way. So there's a main vector. That doesn't tell you anything about what animal it is. What tells you what animal it is, and especially if it's a conspecific, is the pattern of lower order of the constituents of the appendages and how they move in relation to each other. That's what communicates to you immediately that, yeah, this is a person, or I don't know what this is, or it's a dog. We're kind of familiar with dogs, so that we're able to put that together. And so the idea is that it may be the case that the areas that are recruited, notice I'm not claiming causal links here necessarily, that's a further hypothesis for exploration, but the areas that are recruited to represent the upward kinds of structures that are required for language may be areas that have evolved over a long period of time for conspecific recognition, which has the nice property that some aspects of learning language from the standpoint of the child may in fact be deeply rooted in the idea that the child wants to be like the grown-ups. And that part of learning the language is in fact an identification process of yourself as a human, or identification process of yourself as a member of a particular group. And modern sociolinguistic investigations actually supports that as a general kind of notion. So the question is whether we can derive some further ideas about the kinds of constraints we see in language from this hypothesis. I understand, I'm not going to. I will shortly. So the question is, if the mechanisms at issue for constructing larger structures are themselves recruiting what was available to recruit when the symbolic capacity became large enough so that language became a possibility, is based on vision, then we can look to some properties of vision and ask, are there island-like properties in vision, for example? And there's some very interesting examples in this particular case from Ramachandran, who shows you that when you take a picture of a leopard and you move the spots, you see the spots moving. But if the leopard is a leopard leaping, and the spots are moving while it's leaping, you don't see the moving spots. The spots are static. What you see is the moving leopard. In other words, what you focus on is the higher order structure. And in a sense, the spots are, you can't tamper with them, if I can use the language from linguistics. And so that's a possibility. Well, okay, I won't go, I will just finish with, if this will let me, whoops, sorry, with my original text. Although the guy looks unhappy about grammar, I am not. I'm having a very good time. Thanks for your patience. Should we sit here now?
Yes, so could we have all the speakers come and sit down? It actually might be helpful in case we have to switch back and forth between the computers to have Charles here to help out. I don't know if any of the questions will demand that. Okay, so while people are taking their seats, just for people who came in late, let me just repeat my earlier announcement. So we're going to take a group picture of you after the next break. So we're going to ask you to come in 5 minutes earlier than scheduled. So after the question period, there'll be a break, but let's make it a short one. So if you could all be seated in the center section of the hall at 11:50, which is 5 minutes before the scheduled time of the next talk, we'll be able to do that as our last group event. Okay, so the talks are open for discussion. Aura. Yeah.
I have a question for Andrew. It's just a data question. As I recall, there's some work on Basque auxiliaries and agreement by Susana Pejar and Milan Rezek, trying to treat ergative displacement phenomena in syntax. So I wonder if it's the same thing that you're dealing with, or it's a different phenomenon.
Yeah, that process that we were calling metathesis is what some syntacticians have called ergative displacement. And they like to do it in the syntax. But the fact that it doesn't have any effect on any other syntactic properties, the fact that the clitics themselves are left completely intact, the fact that it doesn't change any binding relations, the fact that it has no observable consequences on the syntax. And moreover, the fact that in many dialects what can replace fulfill that position is not just the ergative, but sometimes even the dative. That's a very stigmatized, but still nonetheless attested repair, would require a syntax that could do so many different things that I think wielding Occam's razor with complete reductionism of everything to syntax can lead to a syntax that maybe, as Morris would say, would be like scratching your right ear with your left foot. You can do it, of course, but if you have with enough practice or with enough movements, with enough stretching, but if you have your right hand available here, then why not use it? So I think the resulting syntax one would need to do all of this within the syntax sufficiently strains the syntax in such a way and is sort of loses the generalization that this seems to be a property of well-formedness within words. It doesn't really seem to be specific to the other mechanisms syntax deals with.
Okay, don't work on the topic, so I don't know very much about it. But the ideas were that basically it's when one kind of agreement fails, another agreement happens.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like complicating syntax over much to me.
That, of course, depends on where you need to be in order to trigger agreement. So if you need to move to a specific position to trigger agreement, but those movements have no diagnosable consequences on binding scope or any other relations, then those type of movements don't line up with the other things that syntactic movements often would give us evidence for. That would be the idea.
João Mascrap?
Yeah, that's for Andrew. I think it was first Itziar Laka who called verbal morphemes clitics, and I never understood because why they are called clitics, because I mean they show all the properties of inflectional affixes. So the question is whether your analysis is dependent on their being clitics as opposed to inflectional morphemes.
I think that's very interesting because it cuts to the heart of what the clitic agreement distinction is, and this came up, of course, in Mark Baker's talk. Clitics in Romance, and of course there are people who try to analyze even Romance clitics as types of agreement, right? But there are reasons for thinking that's bizarre, particularly in the case of clitic climbing and restructuring, where you'd have agreement that's leaping 2 clauses up and what have you. And the enclisis, proclisis alternations, which indeed one finds in Basque and one finds in Romance, are suggestive of a kind of movement of elements that suggests independent pronominal-like elements rather than agreement, which is a property of a functional head that's somehow moving around in the clause. One of the other properties that I think is very relevant to the investigation of clitics versus affixes is that clitics in all Romance languages, and indeed in Basque and in other cases as well, are invariant across different tenses. Yeah, you have the same clitics across all tenses in Romance, in all tenses in Greek, all tenses in Basque. That makes sense if they're a D element, because a D element isn't going to change depending on the tense. If it were agreement, it could wildly vary with every tense. So that's another diagnostic that's useful.
Other questions? Luigi, we need a mic over here. Yeah.
Actually, just yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. No, it was sorry. It's again on the same topic, but this sensitivity to tense is quite interesting. So you may wonder, because the phenomenon looks very syntactic to me too, right? And essentially, you have a second position constraint, and then you fulfill it via external merge or via internal merge, essentially. So then the question arises, if the tense sensitivity is better treated if we look at the phenomenon as a syntactic or a morphological phenomenon, and then, at least if it is a syntactic phenomenon, we at least have one device, which is Cinque's hierarchy, which shows that different tenses are realized in different positions in the tree, so that it could be that the availability of a particular repair strategy follows from the position that the verb occupies in the syntactic tree. And the question would be, is that correlation with tense arbitrary? I mean, would you expect a variety of Basque in which the 2 repair strategies are the opposite, let's say, with respect to a tense, to the present past distinction or not? That may provide an argument for the possible use of the syntactic position. I don't know what the facts are.
That's an excellent suggestion. And of course, I don't rule out out of hand the possibility that this could be syntactic versus post-syntactic. What I think the general goal is to try to get a better sense of what properties characterize each of those modules. What are the properties that we can use as heuristics to know that something is syntactic versus post-syntactic in nature? And that certainly would be worth looking into. A phenomenon that I didn't mention here yet is the fact that the metathesis that you find is also accompanied in many cases by doubling, by the clitic showing up in both positions. And that actually makes a lot of sense in terms of Morris, Halley, and Jim Harris's framework about the relationship between metathesis and doubling that you find in some of the Spanish cases they wrote about, like den melon, where the N shows up both on the verb and at the end of the clitic cluster. Now, those kind of cases of doubling, where you really have the same element showing up twice, almost never occurs in syntactic movement. That was one of Jairo Nunez's observations and many others, that doubling really is a characteristic that would be a flag that something is probably not syntactic. So again, that might be a reason for classifying this in terms of a post-syntactic repair. But I think, again, and I'm very pleased that Paul has attempted to work these out in some other way that maybe we'll have a chance to hear about. But I think the goal is to try to identify what are the properties of each component in such a way that we know where to localize operations. Thanks.
So are there questions for Howard, Paul, or Tom? I'm looking for hands. Massimo. But we need the mic. Wait for the mic. Wait, yeah.
Well, a comment about Bever's movement, real movement, actual movement, limb movement. Well, it's interesting because the parallel that you stress, I think, goes even deeper. The three factors in language design, because all biological movement, it has been shown a long time ago, you and I have discussed this a number of times, has this universal physical law, which is the 2/3 power. So if you take the radius of gyration, the radius of gyration divided by the linear speed, millisecond by millisecond, you have the 2/3 power of that is constant and is characteristic of biological movement. That's the physics of the system. Every biological movement reflects this law. And then, well, you have long limbs, short limbs, you move an arm before you move another arm and all that. And this is the details of the things that, as you stress, tells whether it is a dog or a seal or a human being. So you have the physics of the system, which is in this case would be sort of narrow syntax. It would be the merge and locality and all that. It is the physics of the system. And then you have the peculiarities of the different, organism. So I think that the parallel between limb movement, physical movement in space, and language goes deeper, goes quite deep, I think.
Well, I've always referred to Massimo as the bishop from Florence, holier than the Pope. And I think that the question is whether we can cash this out now into understanding specific restrictions in the case of language on the model that it's exploiting the mechanisms that were evolved for vision. And so the question is what the 2/3 law will, I'm agreeing with you, even though it doesn't sound like it, but what will the 2/3 law tell us about certain kinds of properties, at least of spoken language, and perhaps even of the structural constraints on language? That seems to me to be the next step then. Right?
Thank you. Other questions? I think Bruce in the back row. Yeah.
So I have a question for Paul. Vowel harmony is involved in some of the most interesting critiques of optimality theory, and I wanted to bring up one. It's probably, you probably addressed this in your paper, but I wanted to. It seems like worth bringing up as a question here. This is the problem of myopia in harmony systems, pointed out by Colin Wilson. So let me briefly lay out the problem for the audience. The core constraint that you use in your harmony analysis is the simplest possible one. Namely, it says two consecutive vowels may not disagree in the harmonizing feature. Now, where this gets hard is that in quite a few languages, there are blocking configurations for vowel harmony. So like opaque vowels, or if the vowel sequence has a shift in height, the harmony stops. Now, here's the problem for OT. Suppose you have, at the beginning of the word, you initiate a harmony sequence. Several syllables later, you have a blocking sequence. Because there is a blocking sequence, you're going to violate the agreement constraint somewhere. And therefore, the optimal candidate says no harmony at all, right? Because that retains the input form as faithfully as possible, placing the disagreeing sequence right at the very beginning. Okay, so that's the overall scheme. And it seems to be, in principle, a big problem for this approach to harmony. So what do you think is the fix?
Well, we actually, in the paper that I mentioned, we deal with opaque harmony systems of exactly this type. So we deal with two of them. One is the Ostiak or Khanty system Very schematically, the data are in Edith Werthe's book on morphophonematische Untersuchungen, whatever, long title. But the analysis is worked out, I think, for all the crucial cases there with no problem. So I'd have to look at the concrete case that shows that problem, which I haven't encountered, at least in the kinds of harmony systems I've studied.
May I just add to that?
Yeah.
One of the things that's relevant to the specific formulation, maybe that Bruce has in mind, is that the form of the constraints that Paul has are specifically non-directional in nature.
Well, yeah, the direction comes from the faithfulness constraints, so that privilege the initial syllable or the stem or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So in this context, I just thought I would mention a very interesting experiment by Sarah Finley, in which she gives people an artificial language where the results are compatible, ambiguous, between either a directional or a directionless system. And in the directionless system, you'd actually get the global type of property that Bruce mentions, where you would have a majority rules situation, where if there's an odd number of vowels, you end up harmonizing specifically non-directionally, because you would end up with fewer violations in a global sense, given an odd versus even number of vowels. And although such languages don't exist, she uses the tools of artificial grammars to show that people don't generalize in that direction. So that might be a way to bring in more data when the natural languages don't necessarily show us the relevant cases.
Yeah. Mark.
Hardly worth it. This was going to be a question for Paul. I would be interested in your 90-second version of Basque clitics.
Do you need the computer?
No, 90 seconds.
I'll try to help you. I can't help you without text point.
I don't know. Well, so if you deal with it in OT, you have to get it right the first time. You can't get it, the clitics to go in the wrong places and then move them. They have to go immediately in the right places. And so for second position, it's trivial. I mean, you rank two constraints, one that requires the head to be preceded by a clitic, and the other that clitics have to follow the head. If they're ranked that way, then automatically you'll get one clitic in satisfaction of the first constraint preceding, and the others will have to go after. The order, I think, reflects the prominence hierarchy. Okay, wow, it's right up there in the right spot too. So essentially, this is the reverse of the order of the nominal arguments, which themselves reflect the hierarchy of theta roles. So in the canonical word order, you get the ergative, then the dative, and then the absolutive object. And this is just the mirror image of that, which I'm speculating reflects a constituency within this clitic complex. So I'm agreeing with Andrew, not because I know anything about Basque, but because I think he has some good arguments that seems to me perfectly fine, that you have a clitic complex, in fact. And then you get a constraint that determines the order according to the hierarchy. So second position, non-initiality, the T can't be the leftmost morpheme, that is the head, but the clitics have to be adjoined to the right of their hosts. You put those together and you get a simple case, let's say first singular, then the clitic head and the second singular, and of which the first clitic, the one that precedes the head, has to be the absolutive by the third constraint, the case alignment constraint. By the way, there's no need to distinguish the absolutive and the ergative clitics. They have the same form exactly. The only distinction between them is the functional one, right? The dissimulation, what happens is that if you have a first plural absolutive or dative, it's dropped if there's a second person ergative. At least that's how it works in this Ondaru dialect. So again, two constraints. The constraint that prohibits this co-occurrence, okay, obviously needs to be grounded in something, and perhaps in those phenomena that people have called attention to that relate to that, you know, PCC and all of that, much discussed. And it says you can't have both of those, and a second constraint that determines the survivor, which is apparently different in the dialects. In Ondaru it's one thing, in the Samaro it's the other one, so you need two different max constraints which require the realization of respectively second or first person. So here's a big difference, which is that I treat the epenthetic clitic as an actual present tense morpheme. So that's why it doesn't occur in the past. Okay? And that's been suggested by other people, by Trask, by my student Catherine Donahue in her thesis at Stanford. So it's not a crazy idea, at least. It may be wrong, but so it means that this T head itself is unspecified for tense. And so it makes it a lot simpler to manage the distribution of this element in, I think, a much more natural way. So here's some derivations, that is, tableaus, if you like. So, for example, this particular complex is multiply ambiguous. The dosu here can represent the clitic complex in the sentence, you have seen us, you have given it to us, and we like you, where in each case, as the strikeout shows, you've deleted the first plural element. So here's the derivation of one of those forms. We have just the constraints that I've already outlined, plus the last one, which requires faithfulness to tense. That is, you have to have a match between the tense of the input and the tense of the that you actually see in the clitic. Before David throws me out of here, one more, which is what happens in the past. Okay, in the past we can't use this, at least not in Ondaru, we can't use this D or whatever it is, and so we get a completely different form precisely because we have just different morphology. We have a prefix in the present tense, and we only have a suffix in the past, so everything else gets placed in a different position by exactly the same constraints. The only thing that's different is the morphological status of the tense, prefix in one case, suffix in the other case. Okay, so just to the general point is, if you get things to be in the right place to begin with and don't move, then there's one thing that you can't get, namely the possibility that Andrew tries to argue for, which is that while the things are in the wrong place, stuff happens, okay? And then they move to the right place, right? So opaque interactions, okay? And I think that I can explain away all of those, but that's a lot of work, okay? Practically, I think it would take another book.
I'm going to give Andrew 60 seconds to reply, and then we'll take one more question.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah, well, I just want
literal 60 seconds.
I mean, that's very interesting. Of course, the challenge is that last interaction that I showed, where this prefix does apply in the past tense, and you would need something to account for that mismatch. I mean, the intuition, what you've done is basically formalize these things in terms of OT constraints, and that's perfectly fine. My emphasis wasn't on that, it was on the ordering between them. And so in this completely parallel architecture, the notion that having deleted the ergative clitic is what then forces this present tense morpheme to occur in the past is something that still, I guess, would need to be captured.
Yeah, well, it can be done if other constraints preclude, as the last resort, you violate that last constraint. That is, if something forces a constraint violation, then you can get it, but you have to show that there are more important constraints that force that to be the case.
And I guess that's, yes. Yeah.
People interested in Basque might also go back and take a look at Itziar Laka's 1993 paper in MIT Working Papers volume, I think, or some related volume, which shows that the Basque auxiliary doesn't look very much like the picture that we've gotten recently. And they might also go and look at the work done on Basque syntax by Basque-speaking syntacticians.
All of whom work on the standard Batua dialect.
No,
None of whom work
that's
on
not true at
dialectal
all.
form.
We will continue this discussion at the 75th anniversary. I would like to thank the speakers.